Hey, how's it going? This is part 2 of my read-along for the White Guard. But first of all, for those of you that are here because you were subscribed to my Thomas Covenant Unbelievers podcast, I guess you just got to follow along with this if you want, because I don't know how to use Substack to create multiple podcast feeds. It seems only to create one. So I suppose we'll think of this as the Cams Campbell Reads podcast, and maybe we'll get back to Thomas Covenant at some point. But for now, we're doing the White Guard, so stick around or read the White Guard because it's excellent. All right. Or for those of you here for the White Guard, read Thomas Covenant. There we go. Right. Part 1 is linked in my Substack post, and I will be hosting a live call for paid subscribers on Tuesday the 4th of November at 8 PM UK time. If you missed my earlier background post on the historical setting, you might want to start there, and there's a link to that in the Substack post as well. So in this one we're going from chapters 6 to 10, taking us up to pretty much the halfway point in the novel. And we start with chapter 6, Le Chic Parisien. We begin in Madame Anjou's shop, a French boutique known as Le Chic Parisien. Whether this particular shop was real or not has been the subject of debate among literary scholars of Bulgakov. However, it's certainly a facsimile of the boutiques that Bulgakov would have walked past on Kiev's main shopping streets. It has recruitment posters in the window showing the symbolic contrast between bourgeois elegance and revolutionary ruin. We head back to the turbines. Lieutenant Myshlaevsky is making eyes at Anyuta, the turban's housemaid. He makes her nervous. We're told that she'd drop dishes and become distracted in his company. It's a nice little detail of romance in the household. We then follow Alexei, Karas and Myshlaevsky as they report to an as yet unnamed lieutenant colonel in Madame Anjou's shop. There's an interesting bit of dialogue where the colonel asks Alexei if he's a socialist. Quote, "There is one little matter, social theories and all that. You are a socialist, aren't you? Like all members of the intelligentsia." "I regret," Turbine suddenly blurted out, his cheek twitching, "that I am not a socialist, but a monarchist. And I have to say the very word socialist is anathema to me. And of all socialists, I hate Alexander Fyodorovich Kerensky most of all." Bulgakov makes it clear that the colonel is following orders in word, but not in deed. At this point, the colonel doesn't know that the hetman and the Germans are fleeing, but we know that he is sympathetic to Alexei's cause. Once again, we get a contrast between careerists, the colonel, and the turbines. Alexei is not about to betray his beliefs for the sake of advancement. Might his loyalty be misplaced? This idea is covered in Yevgeny Dobryenko's essay in the introduction to the Schwartz translation. It's Dobryenko's thesis that the Russian state has never been worthy of one's loyalty, that it's lacking in a spiritual core, and its whole raison d'etre is self-perpetuation at the expense of the populace. It's an interesting piece and one that I'm still pondering. It's beyond the scope of this essay to go into that idea in any depth, but it's a fascinating thesis. Liberty News. Alexei is attached to a regiment as a doctor and goes home, where Yelena sews on his officer's epaulets. He goes out and buys a newspaper, Liberty News, and Bulgakov treats us to excerpts from the news of the day. This is a fictional representation of the pro-Petlurist national press of the period. Bulgakov would have seen dozens of such titles appear and vanish between 1917 and 1919. For Bulgakov, this freedom paper is an ironic device. It claims to represent freedom and the people, yet it's full of propaganda and moral hysteria. It embodies the frenzied, self-justifying language of revolutionary media that he detested, the very, quote, chaos in print, end quote, that replaced civic discourse. So when Alexei reads it, he's reading not an informative newspaper, but a symptom of the city's delirium. It shows that the old order of reasoned, structured communication has collapsed into slogans and polemics. Real newspapers in Kiev, 1917 to 1919. Bulgakov's fictional newspaper echoes real ones. During those chaotic years, the city had newspapers representing every faction imaginable. Among them, the Kievlyanin, the long-established conservative Russian-language daily, shut down by Petlura in late 1918. Nova Rada, a Ukrainian-language news nationalist paper linked to the Central Rada government. Vyzdrazhenia, Renaissance, supporting the hetmanate under Skoropadsky. Narodna Volya, or People's Will. Similar populist papers emerging under Petlura's directory. Bulgakov's Vestnik Svobody, or Liberty News, folds all these types into one, a composite emblem of revolutionary journalism, self-righteous, chaotic and contradictory. And in the post I've included front pages of all four newspapers that I cited there. The city soon fills with crowds as yellow coffins belonging to young officers are carried through the streets. A voice calls out that they were young soldiers who fell asleep in Popilyucha and were slaughtered by, quote, some peasants together with a group of Petlura's men. Their eyes were gouged out and their epaulets carved onto their shoulders. Ouch. The war has come to the city. Alexei is disgusted. Gymnasium. Alexei reminisces about his time as a student at the gymnasium, then as a student of medicine, and finally as a young doctor serving in the Imperial Army. One gets the sense that these are Bulgakov's own memories. The gymnasium is now a military training ground. Quote, why was there a weapons store in the school? Whose was it? Who? What for? Nobody knew the answers to these questions, just as nobody knew what had become of Madame Anjou and why there were bombs in her boutique lying beside empty hat boxes. End quote. The cadets are undergoing their training, but morale is low. Myshlayevsky gives them a boost with some singing, and the spirit of Borodino is invoked with the uncovering of the portrait of Emperor Alexander. At this point, we're introduced to Colonel Malyshev, the same lieutenant colonel who recruited Alexei in Madame Anjou's shop. Malyshev gives the order that the cadets go home for the night, leaving the gymnasium in small groups and without their epaulets, and return at 7 a.m. the next morning for rifle training. Malyshev instructs Alexei to go home and return at 2 in the afternoon. Myshlayevsky is put in charge of the lights and heating, whereupon an old grey-haired man shuffles up the stairs. It's Maxim, the former beadle of the gymnasium during Myshlayevsky and Alexei's time as students. Alexei finds himself indulging in melancholic thoughts of his past before stepping out into the winter to go home and rest. Colonel Malyshev goes to Madame Anjou's and receives a package from a motorcycle courier at 2 in the morning. We aren't told what the package contains. Chapter 7. We get an evocative description of Vladimir Hill, at the top of which stands a statue of Saint Vladimir himself. This statue is still in place today on Saint Volodymyr Hill, Ukrainian Volodymyrska Hirka. Bulgakov tells us that it would be, quote, absolute madness, end quote, to be up on Vladimir Hill, with the, quote, wind howling through the snowdrifts like banshees from hell, end quote. I included the opening lines from this chapter in the translation comparison section below. City layout. Bulgakov describes the upper and lower city. The Turbines flat is in Podol, which is in the lower city, and we're told that it's impossible, quote, to reach the upper city by going past the lookout point and the water tower, because Prince Belarukov's headquarters were situated in the monastery building in Mikhailovskaya Street. and you were in constant danger of coming across a military convoy or armoured cars, end quote. And I've included a map here that shows the upper and lower cities and where Prince Byelorukov's headquarters are located. The upper city, or Old Kiev/Upper Town, the historic elevated heart of Kiev that contains St. Sophia, St. Michael's, St. Andrew's, St. Vladimir's Hill, and several government, ecclesiastical and aristocratic addresses. It overlooks the river and the merchant quarter below. Lower city, Podol, the riverside commercial and merchant district below the cliffs of the upper town. Historically, the docks, workshops, warehouses and market quarter. It sits on the Dnieper riverbank beneath the terraces and hills of the upper town. Byelorukov's HQ. The monastery on Mikhailovskaya Street is St. Michael's Golden Domed Monastery, located on Mikhailivska or Trochsviatilska Street in the historic upper city, just northeast of St. Sophia and overlooking Podol below. Modern mapping services list it as being on Trochsviatilska Street. And I've given you some coordinates there that you can put into Google Maps and a link to click as well to see it on the map. The Hetman. We move on to the Hetman's palace, where he's disguised as a wounded German major and whisked off in an ambulance. A colonel calls the mortar battalion from the palace in a soft, confidential tone. And now we're with Colonel Malyshev. He's been on an hour-long errand from Madame Anjou's shop in the early hours of the morning. He returns with a similar anxious expression to that of the colonel who called the mortar battalion. The cadets return to the gymnasium for 7 a.m. as ordered. There's tension in the air. Malyshev enters and announces that the battalion is disbanded. Quote, "During the course of the night, there have been marked and sudden changes affecting our position as a battalion, the wider position of the army, and, I would say, the overall political position of Ukraine. As a result, I am announcing the disbandment of the battalion." End quote. He sends everyone home and orders them to remove their epaulets. At this, Captain Studzinski attempts to arrest Colonel Malyshev. It's a moving scene when Malyshev informs the battalion that the hetman and the commander of the armed forces, Byelorukov, fled the city through the night and that they were all now leaderless. Petlura was at the gates with 100,000 troops, and Malyshev was only sorry that he couldn't save his battalion by sacrificing himself. Byelorukov. Prince Byelorukov is a composite fictional character. His title of prince indicates his position as an old-style aristocrat and high-ranking officer in the Imperial Russian Army. His name carries a touch of symbolism and satire, being derived from Biel, white, and Ruka, hand. So he's literally white-handed. The Russian idiom white hands is used to refer to someone who doesn't like to get his hands dirty and could indicate Bulgakov's lack of respect for the commanders in charge while the city is falling apart. Although not directly based on one man, Byelorukov likely draws inspiration from the following. General Alexander Ragoza, the Hetmanate's Minister of War who oversaw the army under Skoropadsky. General Dmitry Batyushin or Prince Alexander Dolgorukov, both Russian nobles serving in the Kiev command at various times. And Bulgakov's own experiences as a military doctor in 1919 Kiev, where he saw similar officers more concerned with paperwork and uniforms than strategy. Chapter 8. On the far Moscow bank of the Dnieper, the illuminated cross on the top of the statue of St. Vladimir rose high into the fathomless sky, shining until dawn. One gets the sense in Bulgakov's writing that St. Vladimir is watching over Kiev as it descends into chaos. Anti-Semitism. We find ourselves in the village of Popelyucha, 8 miles from Kiev, in the company of Colonel Kozir Leshko. Cockrell informs us in his notes that this fictitious colonel was based on the real Cossack leader Kozir Zirka, a search on whose name reveals that he was strongly anti-Semitic and led pogroms in Ukraine. Anti-Semitism was rife in the Petlurist army as opposed to the hetmans, where it was relatively hidden. Bulgakov shows the hetman's officers as reactionary, snobbish and monarchist. His own sympathies lay with the intelligentsia, who feared Bolshevism more than they hated Jews. This difference is important to note as background to the novel. Kozir Leshko leads his troops towards Kiev, and we get an idea of just how big Petlura's army really is. It feels like the city's inhabitants haven't a chance. The city is now surrounded by cavalry, infantry and artillery battalions. It's interesting how much detail Bulgakov goes into about Petlura's troop movements. We move back to the city and follow a Colonel Shetkin as he changes from his uniform into civilian clothes and hides away in an apartment in Lipki, the elegant upper-class district of the city. The writing is on the wall for the pro-hetman officers and, by extension, the whites. We see here that we don't have an omniscient narrator, as we're told that, quote, maybe the foxy hetman was still there, possibly also His Excellency Prince Belorukov. And we get another quote, no, nobody will ever understand what was going on in the city during the afternoon of 14th December. Colonel Bulbatoon. We follow Colonel Bulbatoon into the city. He's a Petlurist officer, part of the Directory's forces entering Kiev under orders from Colonel Tarapiets. Bulgakov uses the name, echoing the real nationalist commander Pietro Fyodorovich Bulbachan, for authenticity. The hetman's army has already collapsed by this point. He meets pockets of resistance as he enters the city. We then follow the tragic fate of Grigory Feldman, a Jewish character whose wife is about to give birth. He meets mounted Cossacks as he attempts to reach the office of the midwife and is cut down with a sabre. Chapter 9. Quote, the reinforcements reaching Pechersk included 14 officers, 4 cadets, 1 student and 1 actor from the Miniatures Theatre. End quote. The defenders of the city are made up mostly of former imperial officers and untrained students. Bulgakov shifts from the Turbines to 2 new characters, the revolutionary official Mikhail Spolyansky and a syphilitic poet Rusakov. It feels out of place to me, being stylistically different from the rest of the novel. In the 2012 TV adaptation, the characters are shown snorting cocaine, and this is alluded to in the novel when a group of prostitutes pass Rusakov and shout, "Had one sniff too many?" Rusakov reads one of his poems and then prays to God to forgive him for writing such rubbish and for strength to rid him of, quote, cocaine, of weakness of will and, above all, of Mikhail Semyonovich Spolyansky, end quote. This scene shows a different kind of character to the Turbines, a glimpse of Kiev's seedy underbelly and how such people are reacting to the collapse. The narrator claims that it was because of Spolyansky that the hetman's city died 3 hours earlier than it should have done. Spolyansky himself enlists in the armoured division and is soon using his corrupting influence on the cadets. Quote, the sentry let Spolyansky through into the sheds. Kopylov gave the packet a conspiratorial wink and asked, "Sugar?" "Uh-huh," Spolyansky answered. End quote. The implication here is that Spolyansky is bringing sugar into the barracks for the purpose of sabotaging the armoured vehicles. Only 1 of the 4 armoured cars is operational, with 3 having, quote, some alien substance, end quote, in their carburetors. In an earlier scene, he questions the legitimacy of the hetmanate amongst his battalion. Quote, you know, my friends, it's essentially a matter of considerable importance to decide whether or not we are doing the right thing in defending this hetman fellow. In his hands, we are nothing but an expensive and dangerous toy, which he can use to impose his outlandishly reactionary ideas on the population. Perhaps Petlura's struggle against the hetman is a historical imperative, and a third force will arise out of this struggle that may well prove to be the only possible correct outcome. End quote. He's not wrong. This scene is portrayed a little differently in the TV adaptation, where Spolyansky challenges one of his battalion after a speech, questioning his loyalty at having sworn an oath to 4 different causes, going back to the Tsar, through Petliura to Skoropadsky. The soldier accuses Spolyansky of being a provocateur, whereupon Spolyansky shoots him. It's in episode 4 towards the end and is available on Amazon Prime, at least in the UK. And then, at the beginning of episode 5, we see him putting sugar into an armoured vehicle's fuel tank. He is indeed a provocateur. Chapter 10. Remember Colonel Nye Tours from Alexei's dream in Chapter 5? Well, here he is, a battle-hardened commander who's given the task of putting a battalion together at the beginning of December. This he does, telling his commanding officer that they won't fight unless the entire battalion is kitted out with felt boots and fur caps. He ends up intimidating the quartermaster to get his request fulfilled, and this gives us a good glimpse into his character and of the pointless bureaucracy that the General Staff at HQ are still holding onto amidst the immediate threat of defeat. Nye Tours' battalion ends up engaging with Kozier Leshko on the streets of the city, and it's our first battle scene in the novel. Bulgakov describes it well, placing the reader in the wintry streets as gunfire is exchanged, and there are casualties. Nye Tours sends off runners to check on the troops at the rear. They soon return to inform him that there are no troops at all, anywhere, whereupon the narrator tells us that Nye Tours, quote, gave the cadets a strange order they had never heard before in their lives, end quote. Could this be the order to disperse? That's how it goes down in the TV adaptation, episode 5. I guess we'll get to that scene in chapter 11. Then I've included a short clip from the TV adaptation with Nye Tours and Kozier Leshko. Nye Tours reminds me a bit of Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore in Apocalypse Now, as the bullets fly past his head and he stands fearless. Meanwhile, Nikolka Turbin is put in charge of the 3rd section of the 1st Infantry Detachment, since all the commanders have gone off and not come back. He's ordered to take the section out into the street. This he does, which we'll get to in the next chapter. Alexei Turbin has overslept. Remember, he was to be back at the gymnasium for 2 o'clock? He gets dressed quickly and heads out the door. He hails a cab, the driver of which reluctantly agrees to take him to the gymnasium. They hear machine gun fire along the way and see officer cadets hanging out at the crossroads. There's no one at the gymnasium, so Alexei heads to Madame Anjou's boutique, where he finds Colonel Malyshev out of uniform and burning documents. Malyshev informs Alexei that the city is taken and orders him to remove his epaulets and make his way home via the city's courtyards. Translator's choices. I have 3 translations of the novel and always enjoy comparing. Who is Karp/Karas? Karp Karas is one of the Turbin's military friends, a fellow officer who visits their apartment for company in the early chapters. He's part of the small circle of loyalist or white-leaning officers who cling to the old order and gather together as Kiev collapses around them. He's typically seen in scenes alongside Chervinsky, the handsome theatrical adjutant, and Myshlayevsky, the loud, cynical officer. Among them, Karp/Karas plays the role of the steady, earthy, good-natured type, a bit of comic relief, but also a man of loyalty and simple values. What does his name mean? Well, here's the fun bit. In Russian, Karas literally means carp, the fish. It's a nickname, not necessarily his surname, one of those military or student monikers that Bulgakov's characters often carry. So, Schwartz chose Karp, the literal translation of the nickname. Cockrell and Glennie chose Karas, the original Russian form, preserving its foreign texture. Both are technically correct, it's simply a difference of translation philosophy. Schwartz tends to domesticate names, make them natural in English, and Cockrell tends to retain Russian flavour by keeping transliterations. The name itself reflects the character's unpretentious, slightly comic nature. He's not a lofty intellectual like Alexei Turbin or a schemer like Thalberg, but rather one of those solid, unremarkable men you can imagine nicknamed after a fish by his comrades. His role in the novel. Karp/Karas contributes to the camaraderie and banter of the officers' scenes. He joins in toasts to the Tsar and debates about honour, duty and Russia's fate. He represents the ordinary, loyal soldier's perspective, bewildered by politics, holding on to camaraderie and ritual, drinking, songs, military stories as the world collapses. His warmth and loyalty contrast with Thalberg's opportunism and with the chaos outside. Opening of Chapter 7. As I read this opening in the Cockerell, then Schwartz, it became quite clear to me which version I prefer. Cockerell's writing feels more evocative and less like a translation to me, but, of course, tastes differ, and you might very well prefer Glennie or Schwartz. There are no right answers. So we have an excerpt here, which in the Russian reads, Глубокую ночью угольная тьма залегла на террасах лучшего места в мире, Владимирской горки. Кирпичные дорожки и аллеи были скрыты под нескончаемым пухлым пластом нетронутого снега. Ни одна душа в городе, ни одна нога не беспокоила зимою многоэтажного массива. Кто пойдет на горку ночью, да еще в такое время? Да, страшно там просто. И храбрый человек не пойдет. So Cockerell translates that as pitch black night had descended on the terraces of the finest spot on earth, Vladimir Hill, whose brick paths and alleyways were hidden under an endless downy mantle of virgin snow. No inhabitant of the city ever sets foot on that huge terraced prominence in the winter time, and indeed, who would venture onto it at night, especially at such a time? It is simply a horrendous place. It's no place even for the brave. Marianne Schwartz. In the dead of night, a coal-black darkness fell over the terraces of the best place in the world, St. Vladimir's Hill. The brick lanes and pathways were hidden under a plump, endless layer of untrodden snow. Neither a single soul in the city nor a single foot had disturbed the multi-tiered tract this winter. Who would climb the hill at night, and at a time like this? It was much too frightening. Even a brave man wouldn't. And Michael Glennie. The coal-black gloom of the darkest night had descended on the terraces of the most beautiful spot on earth, St. Vladimir's Hill, whose brick-paved paths and avenues were hidden beneath a thick layer of virgin snow. Not a soul in the city ever set foot on that great terraced mound in winter-time. Still less was anyone likely to climb the hill at night, especially at times like these, which were grim enough to deter the bravest man. So you can see just how different these translators deal with this phrase here. Look at downy mantle versus plump endless layer and thick layer. It's fascinating. I could study this stuff all day. Nytour's speech impediment, Chapter 10. Colonel Nytours has a speech impediment, and it's interesting to see how the different translators deal with it. Personally, I'm a big fan of Cockerell's Rook Rivery, replacing L's with R's. Schwartz has him speak normally, but describes the impediment with a gerund, burring, and Glennie appears not to deal with it at all. So I've got the Russian here, which is going to be a bit challenging to read out because of the speech impediment, but I shall try. Пишите тгевование ваше превосвидетельство, сказал Най. Нам некогда, нам через час выходить. Не приятель, говорят под самым гогодом. Как? Что это? Живей, сказал Най каким-то похоронным голосом. Right, that was a challenge. Cockerell. Okay, let's get into this one. Sign the requisition order, if you please, your excellency, Nye said. We have no time, we must reeve in an hour. The enemy, they say, light by city. What? Rook rivalry, said Nye in a special sepulchral voice. Oh, I do like sepulchral. Glennie has that as, please countersign the requisition order, sir, said Nye. We haven't much time. We move off in an hour. The enemy is right outside the city. What on earth do you mean by... Come on, hurry up, said Nye Tours in a funereal voice. So no speech impediments at all there. And then we've got Schwartz. Again, no speech impediments reported. Write the requisition, Your Excellency, said Nye, burring. We're out of time, we advance in an hour. They say the enemy is just outside the city. How's that? What on earth? Step lively, said Nye in a funereal voice. So we've got 2 funerals and 1 sepulchral. It's interesting that only one of the translators has attempted to include the speech impediment actually in the text. And I'm all for that. It also features in War and Peace, where one of the characters also has a speech impediment, and it's interesting to look at that. But that's just a by the by, because we're not reading War and Peace. Right, so that's us. Which translation are you reading? Let me know in the comments below. Well, you can do that. This will go out on YouTube as well, actually, automatically, which is losing me subscribers, but hey-ho, it's my channel, and I've had some listens to the first episode that went out, and I appreciate that. So, video call. Yeah, I'm hosting a video call for paid subscribers on Tuesday the 4th of November at 8 PM UK time. I've put together a list of questions which you might want to consider for that call. 1. What did you know about Kiev and Ukraine in 1918 before starting the White Guard, and how has the novel changed your sense of that time and place? 2. Did the novel help clarify who the various factions were, Hetmanites, Petlurists, Whites, Reds, or did it make things even more confusing? The Turbine home. What role does the Turbine apartment play in the novel? A refuge, a symbol, or something else? What does the tiled Dutch stove represent to you? 4. Family and loyalty. How do the Turbines differ from Talberg in terms of their loyalties and moral compass? Do you think Bulgakov is holding Talberg up for judgment? 5. The city as a character. How does Bulgakov make the city feel alive or dying? What emotions does his portrayal of Kiev evoke? 6. How effectively does Bulgakov draw you into Kiev in December 1918? Did you find it easy to visualise the city and its atmosphere of collapse? 7. Chaos and cowardice. Talberg flees while Alexei stays. What does the novel suggest about courage, cowardice and duty in a time of collapse? 8. The populist uprising. How does Bulgakov depict the Petlurists and the social upheaval they represent? Do you think his portrayal is sympathetic or critical? 9. Dreams and visions. What do you make of Alexei's dream sequences and Bulgakov's blend of realism with the fantastic? Do they add insight or distraction? 10. Closing reflections. Reading The White Guard today, do you see any parallels with the world's current political and cultural divisions? 11. What do you think Bulgakov wanted readers to feel by the end? Despair, faith, survival, or something else? So we'll leave it there. I thank you for listening or reading, and I look forward to talking with you again in part 3, in which we will cover chapters 11 to 15. Talk to you later. Bye.